All right, welcome back. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Just a couple quick housekeeping items. We have everybody muted, cuts down on a lot of background noise. So if you have questions over the next 20 minutes or so as we go through these slides, you can ask questions in that Q&A dialog box in the Zoom control panel, and I can answer those questions once we wrap up. I'll also put my contact information up here in just a little bit when we wrap up, so that you can reach out to me directly via phone or email if you have questions or think of something after we get done today. My name is Mike McCarty. I am the President and CEO of Safe Hiring Solutions. I started Safe Hiring 14 years ago. Prior to that, I was a violent crime detective in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a native Hoosier. I had just spent about 8 years in Nashville. Also founded RefLink and Safe Visitor, which is our visitor management system. Done a lot of work for Department of Defense, Justice, Homeland Security over the years on violence prevention work and strategies and consulting, which I'll talk a little bit about as we go through this. But really, what we want to focus on today is a lot of what we've been hearing from our partners and superintendents, and we've had the pleasure of being able to participate in a couple of parent school safety meetings over the last 30 days. We've picked up a lot of knowledge. We understand kind of what parents are feeling. I say that, and I have 4 kids in public schools. I'm sitting here with our VP who has 2 kids in public schools. I mean, everybody on our team has children or grandchildren in schools. So we all understand that from the parent perspective as well as from the professional side of things. And that's really what we wanted to help, is just kind of bring together some, things that we've learned, some things we know are going on in the industry right now that's putting a lot of pressure on schools and parents and feeding into some of this frenzy. These are the folks that we have that guide us. And so on our Safe Visitor Advisory Board, we've got, some really deep thinking professionals. And these are the one qualification that's an absolute to participate on one of our advisory boards is you have to be a prevention-minded person. We do not bring people in who only look to react to situations. And so this group, their backgrounds are extremely varied. We've got a former Navy SEAL. We've got head of a local Secret Service office. We've got, school-based security directors and former law enforcement. We've got FBI. One that I don't have up here is a former national security analyst. We've got police chiefs and vulnerability solutions and assessment experts. So these are folks from all over the country that really help us think. And so as we put together programs, as we've built softwares like Safe Visitor, as we talk through, what do parents need to know, what do schools need to know, as we're talking with policymakers right now, a lot of what we're doing is coming from this group right here that we've assembled because they're all prevention minded. I'm gonna tell you what, not to confuse prevention with not understanding what to do when a crisis hits. These are all folks that know what to do when it gets really hot. I can tell you right now, one of our board members is preparing for a visit, and so as he prepares for a presidential visit, they'll put days and days and weeks into a visit, but I'm gonna tell you what, they know how to handle something if something is to go wrong. But they put that investment in early because they don't want to have to deal with an active shooter in a hallway. And so that's why we kind of built a model based on that same kind of prevention mindset, is we want to invest heavily on the prevention side. Yeah, we want to make sure that we have our schools and we're doing everything we can. We're controlling the flow of people and access control. Not anybody can walk into our buildings, and there's a lot of things you can be doing that cost absolutely no money to increase the security. But we also want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to flag somebody before they want to come to school with a weapon or any other form or threat of violence that could come into the school place. What we've also done for some of our schools that we participated in some of these back to school or safety meetings is we've created some documents, and one of them has this advisory board. And so some of the schools have used this as documents to say, hey, here's the kind of groups we're partnering with, and here's the kind of people that are really guiding, and helping us answer some questions. And I probably spend more than half my day every day either talking with schools, working with schools, vetting programs, helping schools understand what's available in the marketplace. Everything I've done so far today looking at programs, these are not any programs that we will ever sell. There's nothing in it financially for us in the things that I've been vetting all day today. These are programs that we're looking at to make sure that you have the right tools and know which programs are the right ones. We also sent out a survey. I think it went out first thing this morning. So if you didn't get that, send me an email and I'll send it back to you. We're really trying to collect a lot of data and figure out, what you're doing, how you're doing it, what you're looking at, what programs, because you may have looked at something that we've not come across yet or not been presented with, and we would love to, take a look at that program. Because ultimately what we want to do for schools here and across the United States is create a toolkit that basically says this is everything you need in it. Here's the solutions that you need. You're not going to adopt the toolkit in a 30-day period. Sometimes it's going to take years to adopt everything in this toolkit. But again, that's some of the things we want to help communicate with parents to understand that school safety and security, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not a I started to say a 50-yard dash, but that would really date me because I don't think most people know what a 50-yard dash is anymore. So, parents, understand what this looks like culturally for a school and how it's an ongoing, continual process. What we've learned, not only in some of these back to school nights, but really over the last many years, but especially since Parkland back in February, we've learned that parents are nervous. That's no shock. Some of us may have been nervous as our kids went back to school. I'll be honest with you. My kids are in a school district, Crawfordsville, Indiana, where there was an active shooter incident in 1983. So my kids are in a school where there has been an incident. So we know that it can happen anywhere. And so we get that nervousness, and we know that these things can happen anywhere. The problem I think that you're facing in the inordinate amount of pressure that's being placed on you as administrators is there's a huge media frenzy. And I think this is really hitting you as administrators a couple different ways. One, you're probably being inundated with vendors that are trying to sell you everything under the sun. The second part of that is it's creating a frenzy of fear within the parents. And so, their first reaction is we've got to have, a barricaded school, and, we've got to implement all of these gadgetries and everything that arming teachers. I mean, we're seeing it all right now. And so the media, and I've got some friends in the media, and I've talked to them about this. I said, it's like a shark. It's a feeding frenzy right now. And I said, it's really unfair. And some of this fear has even gone to the point where I would say it's unethical, the way vendors are really promoting some of this fear within the parent community. And of course, your policymakers want to act quickly. They want to do something. They want some solutions. And anytime typically we act quickly, we don't always get it right. And so that's where we've kind of, been brought in to provide kind of a baseline and some reasoning here and say, here's where we really need to focus. And that's, the piece we'll talk about as we kind of wrap up kind of what's going on policy-wise here in Indiana. What do we know? Each school is unique. Each, community is unique. How we would approach a vulnerability or security assessment in an urban environment where we have a second phase of an assessment this Friday, and one of their charter schools backs up to probably one of the worst apartment complexes in that entire city. So, culturally and community-wise, very different than if we go to a rural part of the state and conduct a security assessment where they're not dealing with active crime that's happening in and around their school buildings. School cultures are all different. That's one of the first things I learned when I started Safe Hiring. We began working with a lot of schools. Every school's different. Every business model for a school is different. Every culture is different. And so there's no way that from a policy standpoint that can mandate a one shoe, one size fits all kind of mentality. There's no such thing as the safest school in America, and I would be careful to ever brand myself with that. And just simply hardening a school is a very reactionary approach to things. And even when we talk about, this hardening of a school or releasing gases or loud noisemakers, I mean, they're really, they run counterproductive to what we're really teaching our kids. And I can tell you what I teach my kids, and I did it the last day of school this last May, happened to be May 25th, the same day the shooting happened in Noblesville. I told my kids in high school that morning at breakfast, I said, hey, it's the last day of school, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open. My kids know what to do. I mean, if they can locate and hear where something is happening in that school, I said, you run the opposite direction and you don't stop until you can't breathe, okay? But if I can't hear it, not only as a student or an adult or a staff in that school, first responders coming into that situation cannot respond. They can't isolate and know where that incident is happening at. And so, yes, there's some things we can do to make our security better. And there's some things that almost every school that we walk through, things that should be happening. And a lot of times the stuff we point out immediately, they don't cost anything. But at the same time, it's not all about just hardening that environment. I know most of you were offered, the handheld magnetometers here recently. First concept with, first thought with that is, well, how do you wand every student? Well, then they're saying do it on reasonable suspicion. And so, how are you using that? Who's deploying that? If you used them on all your students, when I look in our visitor management system at some of the larger schools across the country that can average anywhere from 500 to 800 non-student visitors a day into that building who could be bringing things into the building as well, how are we managing that? And so there's a lot of questions that have to go into, how do you use certain things and how do we deploy them? And, when I've heard from so many superintendents that they rejected the handheld mags to begin with, but there's a lot of peer pressure now to accept them, but they still don't know how to really use them. What do we know? If we look at FBI study here recently, came out in 2017, one of the things that is really clear when we talk about active shooters is they're not spontaneous, emotion-driven, impulsive type crimes. That really runs counter to what most of us think. Most of us think that somebody gets mad, they get upset, they go get a gun, they bring it to school, they bring it to work, and you have a workplace shooting. The FBI says that is absolutely not true. The good news with that is it means there's prevention and preventable opportunities here. And you can actually download this study off the internet if it's something you want to take a look at, dig into a little deeper. Here's the information in front of you. But that's the good news. And I think if you look at Parkland and some of these other events, you realize that's absolutely true. I mean, some of the first flags that happened in Parkland started 10 years ago when this, kid lost I believe he lost his father first. And then there's a whole succession of things leading up to his mother also passing away, and social media threats and family members calling in to law enforcement, both locally and the FBI. And there was just so many flags that were missed. Right up until about a few weeks before this happened, a Secret Service agent, Steve Wexler, walked through and he basically pointed out all kinds of different things. Some as simple as locking the gate every day outside after the kids arrive and before they're dismissed to basically secure that open compound as schools are in Florida. And so, as we look at this, there are some prevention models that are going to work here. And it's got to be a priority. And so this is where we really want to communicate well with parents to say, here's some things that we can do. Here's what we want to focus on. We want to try to prevent something like this. The Secret Service model is a perfect model. They're probably the only law enforcement agency that I would say are really prevention focused. law enforcement as a whole is very reactionary. Somebody steals your car, we show up. Somebody shoots you, we show up. Somebody breaks into your house, we show up. And so what the Secret Service does is they spend a majority of their time out in front of these dignitaries that they are protecting, going through buildings, going through threat assessment. Who are the people that have made threats in these communities, really trying to isolate and create zones of safety. Why? Because they don't want to deal with an active incident. And that's why I think might have been President Reagan, maybe the last active incident that the Secret Service have encountered. And that's back in what, 82? And so they're very good at what they do. One of the things they will tell you is they have a low or zero threshold for threats. What happens, I think, a lot of times in schools, and I talked to some of the Secret Service guys on our board, is I said, I think the schools have, unfortunately at times, have a higher threshold for threats, and that's not a negative statement. It is, a lot of times we don't even know or are able to weigh what that information is, and that it's a threat, and that it's a credible threat, and what kind of weight do we give to that, and how do we intervene. And so it's really trying to move schools into a low threshold for threat environment. We've been moving that direction for quite some time as the anti-bullying movement has kind of taken off in this country. The threshold and the tolerance for some of these behaviors have become less and less. I mean, schools have to create a care team, a crisis team, a threat team, whatever you want to call that. We evaluated a tool today that we're going to be continuing to work with this group, and hopefully it's a model that'll come to the market. It's not only see something, say something, but it also connects directly with your care team so that it's communicating with somebody. It could be suicide, could be bullying, could be an incident report, it could be any number of things. And then it actually feeds into your crisis team that's going to manage all this information that potentially could be coming in. One of the things I noticed in the governor's committee here in Indiana, their recommendations that came out a couple weeks ago was tasking like FSSA with creating a tool for suicide and reporting. And, my first reaction was, as I went through this, is excellent that we need tools to do that, but we don't need state government to create them because they already exist in the market. And we've been talking with the Lighthouse Project, which is part of Columbia University, that is a validated tool that's been in the market for years. So it's well proven, well vetted, and it works. It's reduced suicides in the Marine Corps by 22%. And it's a free tool to schools. And so what I'm going to explain to policymakers is there's lots of viable programs that already exist in the marketplace that we don't need to create more government or, new government programs when we already have tools that exist that are working well. And so, that's part of what we're doing on the policy side, which we'll get into a little bit more here in just a second. So how do you engage with parents? Communicating with them, is the first thing. And how are you communicating with them? On these back to school safety meetings that we participated in, a lot of what's happening is they're just simply saying, hey, here's what we've done, here's what we're looking at, and here's what we're evaluating. And also understand there's things we can't tell you about because there's going to be things that we deploy as part of our security program that we're not going to advertise, and we're not going to tell you how they work. And so part of understanding from the parent's perspective is there's things going on that we can't tell you this is going on, or we alert everybody to what we're doing. We've seen strong parent response in a positive way in those events where it's including the SROs, the local law enforcement, where we participated, where, it's just really, giving the parents a real good view of everything that the school's doing to keep their kids safe. And it's very comforting to know with the first responders standing there that they're there saying, if something happens, we're going to do everything we can to keep your kids safe. But here's the tools we're also going to deploy, and here's the things we're looking at, and here's some of the barriers that we are coming up against. And so I've seen in Hamilton County, which we've been very engaged in that community, that you've got grandparents that are actually raising funds to look at buying potentially magnetometers, but these are very different, because I said, lastly, I don't want my 10-year-old, my youngest, walking into school every morning and being wanded. Why? Because one, it's going to teach her that school's a scary and dangerous place, and I don't want her to be reminded of that every day. There's solutions coming out that we've been looking at that should be, I think they're in beta right now, and I know Noblesville's looking at this. These are solutions that can be built into the floor or into the walls of a main entryway when you're, channeling people through one entrance. And it can pick up not only weapons, but shapes of weapons and all of this in high traffic areas. And it's all unseen. But it can flag, lock doors, push people certain directions. It can do a lot of things. So, really, looking at how parents, when they become engaged, can be a force that can actually help provide even revenue streams for being able to do some of these things. Explaining to the parents, being prepared and prevention, how they go hand in hand, and soliciting their help, not only, with the see something, say something type model, but social media. We're looking at tools. I think Lauren, who's sitting here with me, is evaluating at least 3 different social media monitoring tools right now. We'll select probably 2, maybe even 3. I don't know. We're evaluating them and which ones we think do the best job. So when you ask us someday, hey, if we want to do social media monitoring, what's a good tool? But I've also told parents, I said, you're the best social media monitoring tool, you and your children. If I sit down at the dinner table tonight and I ask my kids questions about what's going on at school or about certain people, they know everything that's going on. And almost all of it's coming through social media. When I asked them back, in late May, after the Noblesville shooting, when I asked them, hey, do you know any kids in your school you think would be capable of this? All of them whipped off 3 or 4 or 5 names. I mean, they know what's going on more so than anybody else. So when we think of monitoring social media, we've got to engage our kids. One of the things I've talked through recently with a school is really looking at starting a advisory board of students. And I mean, these are the kids know what's happening inside those walls and outside those walls. And we need to be engaged with them and have them involved in this process. And I tell you, I've told lots of parents, it's not all the school's responsibility here. There's a lot of responsibility that rests on your shoulders. And so what kind of things are your kids looking at on TV? What kind of games are they playing? I've been looking at the impact of media violence on kids for probably 25 years, coming out of a background where I helped start one of the first domestic violence units in the United States. And so looking at what impact witnessing violence has on children. Dave Grossman, who's probably one of the most prolific authors and experts on media violence, his most recent book was Generation Assassin or Assassin Generation. And so Dave goes through this and really, talks about this in a lot of detail. And so there's a lot of responsibility. And so the overarching responsibility and picture here is it takes a lot more than just, hardening the school a little bit to deal with this problem. And so it's a big, complex issue. And so the solution is going to be a complex solution. I've told policymakers here, I said the vulnerability or security assessment's the foundation of what needs to happen. I said you don't really know what you don't know until somebody really points out where are you vulnerable at. And so, this is not a threat assessment. It's not an audit. Indiana passed some language in the special session back in May that really was audit type language. And I think the policymakers really were getting it. They just didn't understand it because it's very complex. But that language is more foundationally what needs to happen, which is a real assessment where you're assessing how vulnerable is this school and the buildings. And that really brings into consideration a lot of things. It's not a 2-page checklist. I can tell you that right now. And we've evaluated some of the most progressive schools and SROs, and many of them are using a very simple checklist type tool. and it's got to be a bit more comprehensive than that. And so you're going to look at the physical structure. We're saying you got to look at outer zone, middle zone, inner zone. What do I mean by that? Well, real quickly, an inner zone would be your buildings. Outer zone would be that area around the school, and that could be the neighborhoods, that could be the parking, that could be athletic facilities. And so, looking at those different zones and how do you assess, the safety and security. And then, you can even be talking about an outer zone on the bus routes where you're completely away from facilities now and you're out on the streets pulling up to, stop at different places. Going to be looking at access control. How do you manage that? What are your policies on, emergency plan, safety planning? How do you communicate? How does your emergency communication work? How do you communicate with law enforcement and first responders? What are your emergency plans? What are your reporting procedures? Threat assessment. We're starting to get into more behavioral based stuff. Security equipment and technology, cybersecurity. There's a lot of moving pieces to this, and we're working to create a tool right now with school resource officers, and it's a tool that we think should work in partnership with those officers in your buildings. And so, yeah, it's always nice to have a fresh set of eyes come in, to have us or somebody else walk through. We might see things that others don't. But what we want to do is create a tool also that can be used by your team to not just do, a once over assessment, but you're doing a continuous ongoing assessment. And so we're working with a few schools and SROs right now to help, kind of develop that particular tool. How can we help? When available, we're happy to participate in parent meetings. We've done several of these so far this year. A little advance notice is always good, but we're always more than willing to come and participate in those. We've participated in webinars, i.e. what we're doing right now, but they can be really geared toward parents. We're creating a newsletter that can be shared not only with schools, but with your parents. I launched a podcast earlier in the year, and so we're going to revive that. And a lot of what we're going to talk about in the podcast is information that'd be really good for parents to also be hearing. The idea is we're here to, supplement and support, your team. Legislation. What's going on? Well, as you can imagine, there is stuff coming in from every direction. You've got here in Indiana, the Chiefs Association put out some recommendations probably a month ago. You had the Governor Security Safety School Team Committee, put out a 137-page report a couple weeks ago. It really comes down to about 18 recommendations. If you need a copy of that, give me an email. Be happy to send that back because I'd love to have your feedback on that. And so a lot of stuff coming in, a lot of policymakers have ideas. Everybody's wanting to do something. We've been brought in to help work with and consult on, kind of a comprehensive school security, bill that's going to come out this year. And some of the things that I've been really articulating is, one, I think the vulnerability or the security assessment's the foundation. I think you laid that foundation in House Bill 1230 that came out this past May. It was very difficult in the May language because it requires an audit of every school in Indiana. However, most of that onus was put on the Department of Ed team of 3 to do that, and then law enforcement could loop in when needed. The problem is most law enforcement aren't really trained to deal with some of the policy issues and understanding some of the policy things. And so working with them to say, foundationally, some of the recommendations are coming in, make a lot of sense. We start talking about mental health issues and behavioral issues and how we address them. But by and large, what I'm seeing and hearing over the last several weeks and starting to see in the surveys that are coming back in that we sent out this morning is you don't want more mandates, nor should we really ask for more mandates because we don't want a mandate because, like we said, every school is unique, every school is different, every one of you are at a different place in this security process. And so not looking for mandates, we've brought together a lot of solutions that really can work and help, and a lot of them, like I mentioned earlier, at no cost to schools. And so we're really trying to bring some clarity to how you craft a bill like this and offer opportunities for schools to be able to access some of the things that they need. We understand there's a lot of pressure being placed on policymakers, but arming teachers, is that where we want to go? I'm never going to be the one that sits here and says absolutely never on anything, because as soon as I say that, I understand that active shooter incidents are generally over the minute that person's engaged. I get that. However, to simply say I want to arm a teacher or some employee inside that building, there's a lot more to that than just simply saying that's a viable idea. I'll be honest with you, I knew as a police officer, every single time I walked into somebody's home, I was bringing a weapon into that home, and it was my responsibility and pressure on me to make sure I maintain control of that weapon at all times, because if not, I'm in big trouble. And so there's a lot that goes into it. So maybe it's not necessarily arming teachers, but maybe what we need to do is create opportunities for our trained law enforcement in the buildings to have a place to bring in their long weapons so that they're not in their vehicles. Because what do we know? If an event started inside the school, if they have to go outside into the parking lot to retrieve their high-powered weapon, it's over before they get back inside. And so, that's the kind of clarity we're trying to bring to some of the recommendations, is saying, where do we start? Where do we focus? And really looking at some of the things that need to be focused on first. We don't need more bureaucracy. We don't need more software being created by the state, because there's many of these tools that already exist in the marketplace today. Funding, and I had a great conversation last week with a group that's working with us on this, both here and across the country. And there's some real unique funding sources, things I had never heard of before, and I'm not really going to say them right here. I'm just going to tell you these are some things we're bringing out to the policymakers, is there are viable funding opportunities for schools that have never been tapped into, that I had no idea that this money could be used for these types of programs. So, really wanting to make access to those kinds of funds, which are large, much more easily for you to obtain to do some of these things that need to happen. But when we start looking at the mental health side of this and creating a crisis team or a care team within a school, we got to start talking about social workers and psychologists, and how do we bring in the right mix of really trusted partners to help with the mental health side. Because the minute you start deploying a see something, say something, suicide prevention, some of these tools, the amount of potential response that you're going to get from this is going to could be extremely high. And so you got to be prepared foundationally to be able to handle that and to be able to deal with it correctly. So what are some of the things we're working on? Kiosk. Some of you may be using our Safe Visitor right now. We'll have a kiosk out, I think, by the end of the week in the first version. This will allow you to deploy between the doors, scan in, scan out before they actually get into the building. Arrest alert, we are releasing it this week as well. And what is arrest alert? This is real-time monitoring of arrest data. This can be for employees, for contractors, for volunteers, and the pricing is very low. I think for a volunteer, it's $1 a volunteer per year, and that's to have real-time monitoring and get an alert if they're arrested for anything during that time period. Facial recognition, got a call on Thursday to dig into this a little bit deeper, but that's where we're going in Safe Visitor, where your face becomes your ID card. But also we can put people who are not allowed on the property. Could be a student like in Parkland, could be anybody that's made a threat toward the school. If we have their photo or information that we can add to the system, or an exclusion list where it could flag them, and the one we're really looking at partnering with is totally agnostic, and that's my big pet peeve is we don't want something that requires you to go buy their hardware. We want a solution that's completely agnostic and will work with any system. Reunification module, how do we account for everybody in the unfortunate event that there is some kind of incident. Security assessment software, like I mentioned earlier, and then you start to combine, and connect your threat assessment, you connect your system, student information system, your incident response system, social media. We just did an integration with Skyward student information system, and we now have a module in Safe Visitor for early dismissal that scans against, who's approved, excluded parties list, captures the parent and a photo of them picking the child up and documents and stores that. Those are the kind of tools we're creating. We also understand, kind of lastly, that active shooters are driving this conversation, but your biggest threat still is not an active shooter. I told a policymaker here back in June, we had a meeting, and I said, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about all things active shooter, because that's what parents want to talk about, and that's the voters, and that's what everybody in the media is talking about. But the reality is, if you picked up the newspaper in Indiana that week, we had 3 separate school employees, all coaches, I believe, that were arrested for having either sexual relations with a student or inappropriate relationships with a student. And so we're going to factor in all types of risk into these risk assessments, not just the active shooter, and that we really focus on, all things that impact the safety and security of the school. A lot of information, I get it, and we're probably running over just a hair. I'm going to stop and see if we have any questions, and I'm not seeing any questions. Either that I put you all to sleep or all has been answered. Again, you've got my contact information right here. It's my direct line, my direct email. You think of something, feel free to send me an email. Give me a call. If you want a copy of the recommendations that have come out, just send me an email. If you haven't gotten a copy of the survey we sent out today, we'd love your feedback. Email me and I'll send you a link back for that as well. Otherwise, thanks for joining us, and we hope you have a great day.